accessible design in GUIs. We can talk about it broadly, but I think let's start with just a little bit of context about how we achieve this in Quorum. As Stepik was mentioning earlier in the week, talking about the need for us to build Quorum Studio, why we're building these GUI libraries, etc. We have a lot of interest in making an editor and also designing actual output that is accessible. And the way that we are achieving this is in some ways through just little innovations in the editor for things like the smart zooming or for the smart navigation. But the biggest thing for us is that we are making a system that whatever you're producing, it has native level information that is accessible to the screen reader. We are trying to provide information that the screen reader or other accessibility tools like braille displays, etc., they have the same ability to read information in our complex graphics card accelerated rendering environment that just a series of forms on the native operating system might have. Past the underlying features, the high level that we need to care about as programmers as to how we can give accessibility to users is making sure that our programs have enough information that the program knows how to move about its environment. It knows which buttons connect to which other buttons or other controls in the tab ordering. So it knows if I'm tabbing through, how can I get to different components. Past that, there are some things that we've done in Quorum Studio, which I expect are going to be promoted to real feature language status, as opposed to just things that are possible to do in the language, which include having different windows or domains. If I'm saying anything wrong, by the way, Sina, that my terminology is wrong, feel free to jump in. I know I don't need to tell you, but catch me if I'm saying something wrong. Things like being able to use F6 to navigate between the high-level components. We have some features like trying to add in, like if you're trying to escape from a dialogue, the escape key closes it by default. We're adding as much as we can by default, but some level of information is required from the programmer in Quorum.
And right now, more than will be in the
Yes.
future. So for example, right now, when we talk about focus, where someone is in the interface, sometimes this is referred to as someone's point of regard, right? Focus is kind of a shorthand for that phrase. Are you on the OK button? Are you on the cancel button? So you know that highlight, that box that comes around, that focus ring around a component when you're tabbing through an interface, that's the focus indication, right? And so right now in Quorum, you have to set that traversal manually. You have to say from the OK button, the next component is the cancel button. From this checkbox, the next component is that checkbox, right? Just like how William showed the layout, the flow layout, basically on Monday, I think it was, we can do that for focus as well. It's just not in there yet. So eventually you'll be able to just add a button, add a button, add a button, and the focus will be logical, but that's just not done yet right now from an implementation. So what it means is that if you want your application to behave sensibly with a keyboard, you need to let it know from any given component what's the next component that one would go to. Does that make sense?
If you don't, it is random arrangement?
No,
just
unfortunately
doesn't
there's no arrangement, which is suboptimal in the extreme. It just didn't make it into this release. It's not that it was an intentional thing, it's just it is a clear thing that I don't think anybody disagrees with, that the focus management as default in Quorum right now is absolutely not where it needs to be. But it's just one thing that needs to get fixed in Quorum 8, which is that as you add components, the focus should be figured out at least in a sensible way, automatically, and then the developer should override. Right now, you have to explicitly state the focus traversal.
So maybe before we continue more in depth about how the various components ought to be made accessible and the high level of the sort of information that the rest of the system should have, maybe let's talk a little bit about setting the focus traversal order in Quorum, making just a basic application to handle some of this stuff. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Before we dive into that though, are most of the folks in the room familiar with how a screen reader works? And I don't mean like the basic level, I think we all sort of have that, but just like sort of like, not necessarily all the way under the hood, but just how a screen reader interfaces with an operating system, with a browser, with an application.
I would like more information.
So So there's a lot of moving pieces, but at the end of the day, you have various applications, various contexts that run on your computer, okay? Whether it's Microsoft Word, Firefox, the Windows Explorer, it doesn't matter. You have these different applications that run. And if you think about it, those applications are nothing. They're just pixels on a screen that have some business logic behind them. When you hit this button, a spell checker runs. When you hit this other button, it loads google.com, right? But it's, at the end of the day, there's no semantic information yet. We're just having pixels on the screen, right? So we need to link up. How do we have that semantic information? How do we know that something is an edit field? Something is a button. Something is a file menu. Something is a checkbox. How do we translate that to a screen reader, right? And that's where these UI libraries come into play. So Apple has one. The web has several ways of doing this. Quorum has one, right? And the trick is translating, giving the screen reader access, or any assistive technology, access to saying, where am I? Like, what's this thing? Where is the user right now? And how do I read it to the user? How do I braille it to the user? So that's done through a series of different acceptable, standard technologies. And the one in Windows that we're relying on is called UI automation. So UI automation is a standard set of libraries that's in the operating system that says, you can use me to interface with a screen reader. The screen reader knows how to talk to me, knows how to talk UI automation protocol. And because of that, if you, the programmer, say that this thing is a button in UI automation speak, then I promise the screen reader will announce button. I promise the screen reader will announce the label of the button, the selected state of the button, a checkbox, whether it's checked or unchecked, okay? So it's just a standard agreed upon protocol, right? The tricky part is UI automation and pretty much every accessibility binding that we have today are some of the ugliest pieces of code you will ever have the displeasure of dealing with. And I'm not being hyperbolic here. They are truly horrendous, okay? Microsoft wrote UI automation, but it's an equal opportunity. Apple's is not great, it's just a little bit better and baked into the operating system. Linux has iAccessible too. So they're all pretty nasty because they've come out of a lot of legacy, the 80s and 90s, and it's not like it was invented a year ago. It's decades of legacy behind it. And the way we've built software has evolved over those years. So if we were going to have you guys make things accessible using UI automation, you would not even after a week get a button to read with a screen reader, I guarantee you, okay? That's a problem. So what these guys have done is they have taken a year of agony and mapped all of that stuff into Quorum so that when you go button, my button, button set name, okay, magically JAWS can say okay button, okay? So they've taken thousands of lines of really hairy code and made it 2 lines of code in Quorum, okay? And that's true for panels and tabs and lists and all sorts of stuff like that. And so when you think about accessibility issues, not only in Quorum, but in any application, it's not always, oh, the developer didn't do X, Y, and Z. There's this multi-step problem of, is the bug in the screen reader? Is the bug on the web page, like on the web, for example? Is the bug in Chrome's actual code, right? So there's all these pieces that have to work perfectly before a blind person hears okay button, okay? It's literally just 10 different components, all of which have to talk to one another.
And all of which are made by different people.
All of which are made by different people, all of which have been made at different times, all of which don't have a consensus around how to speak to one another. And this is really like the heart of most accessibility errors that we see in today's world, okay? And so what William's talking about is there's a few things that you need to do as a developer when you're building interfaces in Quorum to make your applications more accessible. As time goes on, Quorum 8, Quorum 9, Quorum 10, those things will become less and less. You'll have to do even less work to make your applications accessible because Quorum will do more of it automatically for you. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay. So to that end, there's also a couple of conventions that I think are really important to understand. A lot of people are under the impression that, for example, like the tab key is the only way that a blind person may navigate an interface. And in a desktoping environment, that's somewhat true, but not really. And in the web, that's really not true. And so it's really important to know some of these assumptions if you're going to be building user interfaces, because those are the assumptions that your users will bring to the table when they put their hands on their keyboard and they want to interact with your game. They want to interact with your UI. They want to interact with your application. And so just a couple of those is, tabbing is one, it moves you between elements. But imagine a really complicated program like Quorum Studio. If you had only the tab key, you'd be sitting there all day. And also, in the editor, if tab does an indent, so how do we tab out of the editor, right? There's all these problems. So that's why, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mind if I personally record you on my phone so that I can, I want to have this for
No,
my own
okay,
purposes.
go. So F6 is one possible traversal pattern. This came out of a lot of older Windows style applications. F6 means move between containers. So you know how like there's the project tree view in Quorum, and there's the editor, there's the toolbar, there's the output tabs, there's the input tabs, all of these things. Think of those as areas, as logical units. They have components within them. The toolbar has new project, open project, run, stop, debug, all this stuff, right? The projects window has a tree view where you can up and down arrow and go between all of your projects and expand your projects and look at all of the files. So you can use the arrow keys and tab keys to get around within a container, but the way you move across containers is with the F6 key. And you can try that in Quorum Studio if you have it in front of you right now. If you keep hitting F6, and if you want to go the other way, you hit Shift F6, just like with tab, you hit Shift tab to go backwards. You can cycle between the different areas of Quorum. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this is a standard mechanism for traversing complicated applications. You tab between an individual container, but then tab is trapped intentionally within a container to give you a logical view of that just one area, and then you use F6 to go between places. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Any questions on that stuff? So,
So how do you jump in and out along a nested container structure?
so a nested container structure, as far as Quorum is concerned, is still the parent container is what the F6 would map to. It depends on what the nesting is, because if you imagine like a multi-tab list, you could think of that as a nested container, where we F6 to all of the possible outputs, we can tab across them, but how do we switch across the tabs? Well, that's why we have tabs in the first place, because then you can use Control Tab and Control Shift Tab to move across the tabs. So Quorum, William, if you bring up Quorum Studio on the screen,
Yes.
and do you have, can you open like a couple of files just so you have multiple tabs on?
Yeah, I've got two open right now. I
Okay,
can make some more.
Cool. So he can hit Control Tab and Control Shift Tab to move between those tabs, even though he's within that container. Are you demoing that?
Yes,
Okay.
I am.
And so, does that make sense to
Yes.
answer your question? So like that's one form of
And
nesting
then
container.
F6, then you jump out.
Excuse me?
You have
Then you
F6,
jump out.
then you
That's
jump
right. That's exactly right. You go to the next thing. You go to the
console
output.
area.
Exactly. And then you can use Control Tab in there. If you want to close one of those tabs, you can do Control W. We're probably going to switch that a little bit. That's more of a Mac construct, Command W. On Windows, the standard key for that is Control F4. And so we'll switch that to make it match standard behavior for tabs. And by the way, everything I've said works in your web browser. You open up Chrome, you open up a bunch of tabs, Control Tab moves you between your tabs. Control Shift Tab moves you backwards between your tabs. You want to close a tab in Chrome, Control F4. Everything I've said is the standard stuff. We didn't make it up for Quorum. These are standard behaviors that a lot of blind people know on the keyboard, okay? So that's tabs and moving around the interface and things like that. For getting into the file menu, I think most of us are familiar with hitting the Alt key, right? And so, is that true? Yes? Okay, so the Alt key takes us into the menus. Now, one of the things that Quorum needs to add, and doesn't just have right now, is mnemonics. So mnemonics are where, you know how you have like file and the F is underlined in some applications? Or run and the R is underlined, right? That means, that's what the interface is telling you is, you can hit Alt followed by the underlined letter to activate the thing, right? Alt F is file, Alt R is run, Alt A is the about menu, whatever, okay? Again, everything I've said, this works in Firefox, works in Outlook, works in Word, etc., right? And so those are mnemonics. When you see those underlined letters, it says this is the key that if you hit it with the Alt key, I will do this thing. And a lot of installers, you know how there's the next and back buttons? and the N and the B are underlined, that's really helpful because it means you don't have to tab all the way to next and then hit space and then go, you can just hit Alt N. Boom, you've activated the next key. Alt N again. Boom, you've done it. You want to hit the I agree button, it's Alt A because the A is underlined, right? And the screen reader tells you this. The screen reader will say something like, I agree, checkbox not checked, A. And so that tells you, oh, the A is the mnemonic. Does that make sense? There's a difference between mnemonics, though, and shortcuts. Shortcuts are generally accorded with the Control key instead of the Alt key, all right? So it sounds like a subtle distinction, but it does make a difference. Control C, what does that do on most systems?
Close.
Copy.
Copy.
Copy, right? So Control C is copy, right? That's a shortcut, because it's a global key you can hit anywhere in the editor, and it copies something. Control V is paste. Control X, cut. Control Z,
Delete.
do. Control Y, redo. Control F is find. Control Shift F is usually a form of advanced find, right? Control G is usually go to. There's all these like conventions, right? And so, like in Quorum, we have Control B for build, Control R for run, right? Control S is almost always save, right? So these are shortcuts. So I just distinguish between them because when you're in a file menu, you might see two things. So are you on Windows or Mac right there?
I'm on Windows.
Okay, open up Notepad,
Sure.
and then just click the file menu. And then you have like a save and save as.
Give me a moment. My laptop is moving at the speed of
It's Quorum.
not a fast thing.
It's Quorum.
Speak down the thing.
Okay, file menu is open.
Okay, and you see save as,
Yes.
and the A is underlined?
Yes.
And it also, okay, perfect. So leave that open. So you see how that A is underlined? That means two things. It means one thing in here. It means you can hit the A key when this menu is open, and that is the function that will be activated. Which means you don't have to go Alt F, down, 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 enter. You can go Alt F A, and that's save as, right? And this really matters, because if you think of the number of keystrokes someone who's blind has to perform on an interface, it quickly exceeds hundreds to thousands without even sweating. Like, it is not hard to imagine a blind person performing thousands of keystrokes in an application in like a 15-minute usage pattern. It's just not hard to imagine that. So anything we can do to reduce the number of keystrokes is a beautiful thing. All right? Does that all make sense? So look at
Because most of the keys show that arrows and arrow keys.
what about the arrow keys?
I mean, most
Oh
of
yes,
the keys show
most of
that
the
arrow
tab,
keys.
the arrow keys, but all these shortcuts as well, right? And so like go to edit, and you see undo. Okay, so that would read something as like undo disabled because it's grayed out, right? Control plus Z, and then what is it in there? U?
Yep.
Okay, so undo disabled because it's not selectable yet because he hasn't typed anything into Notepad, so there's no undoable state right now. It tells you the shortcut, it also tells you the mnemonic. So that has both. That's the distinction. U is the mnemonic. It means that it only works in this file menu. But Control Z, that works globally. That's a shortcut. Does that distinction make sense?
Yes.
Okay, so those are some of the popular ways of navigating a keyboard interface. Now, if you think about radio buttons, I'm trying to think what's something that has radio buttons in Windows as a matter of course.
I could pop up in Visual Studio and we could start looking around the properties if you want.
Sure. Yeah, that would work. So radio buttons are a little odd, right? They're called buttons, so you would think you'd use the tab key to go across them. We talked about it a little bit when I think Stefik was doing that lesson, if you guys remember that conversation. Radio buttons, you don't tab across them. So let's say it's asking you, what meal will you be joining us for? It says breakfast, lunch, or dinner, right? So let's just say that those are radio buttons, okay? How would you imagine a keyboard user would interact with that control? You tab and it says, what meal are you joining us for? And it'll say, breakfast, one of three. How would you get to the second and the third choices? The arrow keys, right? Why is it not the tab key?
First, I would make you go to the next question.
the next question. That's exactly right. So you see how this hierarchy of semantics is being respected? That hierarchy is the fundamental basis under all of digital accessibility. We could be talking about Word documents, PDFs, EPUB files, web pages, Outlook applications, or 3D games. It does not matter. This hierarchy of semantics, that's what's important. And so by just recognizing that F6 moves us at a gross level, tab moves us at a little bit more granular level, arrow keys move us within a component, enter activates something, but enter is a very interesting one. Enter is usually reserved for the default behavior of a dialogue. So we were just talking about dialogues. Imagine one that says, would you like to save yes or no? And the yes is highlighted by default. If you hit enter, it means activate the default thing. Even if you're not on the yes button, enter means activate the default thing. Spacebar means activate the thing I'm on, okay? So that's that's a subtle distinction, but again, super important, right? So spacebar is actuate the thing I'm on, right? Click where I am. Enter, do the default behavior. Enter, log me into the application. Spacebar, check the box that says remember my password. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on that stuff? About accessibility in interfaces in general.
So how does the user discover that the default?
Right. So a lot of this has to do with onboarding and education when it comes to assistive technologies. So users have a variety of ways of getting exposed to this information when they're learning a screen reader. These are the things they need to be learning, right? The screen reader then offers you different shortcut keys for reading various components and doing other things. But these things are like the fundamentals of how to use an interface with a keyboard. And the more of these rules that you know, the faster you can traverse an interface. So what oftentimes happens is that screen readers will include hints or help text. So for example, on iPhone, they call them hints. And so if I turn this on here,
50% dog messages.
So I've got hints off right now. I'm going to go turn them on.
And here work speaking bump hits enabled.
Okay, now if I touch messages,
Messages. Double tap to open.
you see,
Use
so
3D touch to show home screen actions.
or if I go to this
Scroll
slider,
Page 2 of 13. Adjustable. Swipe up or down with one finger to adjust the value.
okay? So what it does is it gives you a help text, but again, it's following a principle called semantic prioritization, which is a fancy way of saying put the important stuff up front. Don't say, you're on a button. It's called messages. You can double tap to activate. Oh my God, you go crazy, right? You just say the important stuff first. Messages, button, double tap to activate, right? So the order matters, right? And that's why when you're learning the interface, you leave stuff like that on. The more advanced you become, you turn off some of those verbosity options. And you say, I know how to use a checkbox. I don't need to hear press spacebar to toggle anymore. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Any other questions on that stuff?
So the tab and then the hierarchy formation. Well, I haven't used a voiceover so
Mhm.
long, but voiceover has weird way of getting
Yes.
into, getting out
Yes.
of and stuff.
Yes. So voiceover took a very different tact to making interfaces accessible. All the stuff I've said is true. Buttons, mnemonics, shortcuts, checkboxes with spacebar, all of that stuff is true. But there's one difference. With VoiceOver, they wanted even something like, a group of buttons in a dialogue, for example, in a pane, to be one tab stop. And they make you drill down into a component to interact with that component. It actually says press, and it's Apple, so their keyboard mappings are like press Command plus VoiceOver plus Shift plus I to interact with the component. Okay, so what all that means is, tell me to drill down and interact with these 4 buttons, and then when you're done, stop interacting and go about your way. So imagine, it's like a kaleidoscope. They're adding one more layer, and their thinking behind that at Apple was that they wanted to make it even easier to get a high-level overview of the interface. Then if you want to go mess with something, you push the interact key to interact with that thing, right? It's just a different paradigm. It's not one that anybody else employs, and on the iPhone, it's not even done. It's only on Mac OS that they do it that way. And it, honestly, I think it's a creative idea, but there's a reason why in the 90s a lot of screen readers chose not to do that, and that's why.
And what is the reason?
So you end up getting into these situations where you are forcing the user to interact with something, but it's very unclear what the modality of that state is. And so you'll say, edit field, interact to edit. Well, the thing is, you know they're on an edit field. Just let them hit enter, okay? Let them actually just start typing. But on Mac, you have to interact with the edit field and then begin typing, right? So now slowly over time, they've actually started backing this out. For example, on edit fields, they do let you just start typing because they realized how annoying that was, right? So they're slowly backing out of it. But imagine like an options dialog where it has a drop-down menu and it says yes, no. You can't just tap to it and use your arrow keys. You tap to it, then you use the interact key, and then you can toggle between yes and no. And so it's just a different paradigm, but one I feel that's less efficient overall.
It makes more sense in an environment where you're just reading. Like if it's just a huge globule of text, you don't have to manipulate anything. Okay, maybe.
That's right.
You could argue that.
Yeah, exactly. But remember, the entire point of audio interfaces is to put up walls. I know that sounds weird, but it's really true. Okay, the more walls you can give someone, the easier it is to build a mental model. If you give somebody an interface with 70 different things on it, it's very difficult to keep that in your head, right? So the cognitive workload for that, the cognitive load is very high. If you can give them walls where you say, well, okay, this application really only has 3 areas, and these 70 controls are split over the 3 areas. Why don't I give you a way to explore the 3 areas first, then within area number 2, there's 4 more areas, then within the first area under area number 2, there's 2 more, right? It's a componentization, it's a hierarchy. Then you can make it easier for the user to do something at any given time. Where this breaks down, of course, is when you need to do something from area number 2 and area number 3, and you need to navigate between them very quickly. Then this model actually ends up working against you instead of for you. Which is why a lot of Windows screen readers, all Windows screen readers, flatten the interface, and then they allow you to jump around. Okay? That's getting into like esoteric screen reader construction, but it is important. So any questions on that stuff? So lastly, I'll just end with a little piece of, just information / trivia. When we talk about web accessibility, what ends up happening in your browser is that the browser goes, these pixels that CSS has told me how to position and the rendering engine has positioned for me make the Google search button on the screen. I gotta now go tell a screen reader that this is a button, right? There's no real button in your browser. Buttons don't exist in browsers, okay? Browsers just paint the screen from whatever HTML that you've written. But they lie to the assistive technology and say, there's a button here, and that's how you make the web accessible. And that's what a lot of smart and very diligent people did 15 to 19 years ago, is they revolutionized how screen readers interact with the web. And that's called the virtual buffer and the virtual cursor, and there's all sorts of, things around that. Okay, so that's kind of like the, multiple years of interfaces in 5 minutes or less kind of lecture. For something simple and concrete so we can get our heads around it, let's just worry about how do we set focus tab focus in Quorum. So let's make an application with a couple of buttons and just figure out how to navigate between them. William, I'll leave that to you, but I'll jump in.
We will begin by relaunching Quorum Studio because my laptop was just choking to death as I was trying to launch Visual Studio at the same time Quorum Studio was going on. And I managed to get Visual Studio open just in time for us to not look at it at all. So, excellent use of my time. So Quorum Studio is popping up right now. First thing that I figure we'll do is we'll just make a new project so that we can do our work in a clean environment. So I'm going to make a new project, and we'll just call it a focus project or something along those lines. It will be, once again, using our GUI library, so we're going to be using the game templates to give us a starting point. And I will finish loading soon.
And this is a what? Work making
We're going to be making a new game templates project.
project, yes. But if it's on what now? I mean, the other one was dialogue, so this
I-
You can think of this one as on focus.
On
Yeah, this one's the
focus.
focus.
I gotta call it something.
I was trying to demonstrate the F6 allows you to jump between places in Quorum Studio, and F6 is my mute button on my laptop. So
Yes. So actually, hold on, you just highlighted something that other people are gonna run into. So on laptops, especially on Mac, like where they default, and a lot of Windows PCs, I know like Amir and I, it's one of the first things we turn off, they default the F1 to F12 keys to like media controls and other stuff. So you have to hold down the function key to get the F key behavior. You can turn that off, and so your F keys can be the native, you know, F keys. But just be aware of that. If you're trying to use like F5 or F6 or F7 or whatever, and it's not doing what you expect, it's because it's trying to do media functionality. And so you have to hold down the function key while pressing it.
Alright, so getting my project set up here now. We have about 20 minutes before lunchtime, so in the interest of making sure that everyone gets their well-earned lunch, we'll stick simple for this project. What I'm thinking that we'll do is we'll add just a few buttons on here, just 3 simple buttons. We'll give them all separate names, and we can set them up with something very simple just so that they do something. They can output to the console, and we will tab between them, and we can see how you can navigate that with no mouse whatsoever, just using the keyboard. So, first thing I'm going to do is just remove all of the extra comments that the template generates for me so that everyone can see what's going on here.
You said 3 buttons?
Yes, I'm going to make 3 buttons here. So I'm going to start by adding my use statement for the buttons. And delete, he got stuck again, that's not good. In addition to the button, I'm also going to add a layout to the game. This one, the layout has no bearing currently on how the tab ordering is handled, although I don't know if that will be true in the future. But for right now, it does make it easy for the game to figure out where to put the buttons on the screen, so I don't have to go manually position them, so I'm going to go ahead and add that in. Alright, so I have just set up my environment, and I'm giving everyone a little bit of time to get all the same code in. But I have just set up my environment, so I am adding a flow layout to my game. I have created 3 buttons, which I have named first, second, and third, and I have added all 3 to the game. Key component here is that right now I have done nothing to set up the tab traversal order, and I have not set a focus on anything to begin with. So when this game launches, this game will currently not be accessible to the keyboard user. regardless of whether the screen reader is on, regardless of any kind of assistive technology, this is currently not a keyboard friendly application, simply because when the window launches, the game will not have focus on any of the components, and none of the components have any kind of claim to any kind of focus order, so you will be stuck. Expect this to be one of the things that we work to patch out, because that's obviously really not good, that it's possible to get stuck. But the key thing is that regardless of that, there's no indication to the environment right now how should these buttons be related to one another in terms of their focus order. So before I set that up, I am going to build and run this just to make sure that the code that I have is
Up
correct.
just a little bit to make sure I didn't miss anything at the top. Oh, okay, that's what I missed, hang on.
I did make the layout as a field as opposed to in the create game. There's not any particular reason that I did that, it's simply,
Oh,
Oh.
layouts, that's where I missed my S. Like, okay, why am I missing something?
yeah,
Okay.
I cannot wait to have the
Sounds
editor
like
heads back in
messed
so I can just press a hotkey and just have it.
Oh, I'm trying to keep up with you, you're so fast. Okay, I think I got it all now. I think I do.
Alright, so let's go ahead, let's build it, give it a run, make sure that we've done what we think we've done.
I can't keep up with this typing. Whoa, it's not liking my stuff. I got a lot wrong here, 25. Do I need capitals? No, I would use these, wouldn't I?
Yes,
So I need to use capital word or this word?
that's the word you should use.
Because it doesn't like
Oh, right
25
here.
and 29.
Third
Oh,
is-
third, okay. Because I'm like, am I supposed to use the capital down there or not the capital? Because I'm supposed to use
Yeah.
this word here.
Yeah.
Yeah, use the same name in both places with the same capitalization.
All right, now,
Go ahead and click on the,
okay, now
There you
it
go.
likes
there
it.
you go.
Okay, so I have to use the lowercase one when I'm
Yep, you
adding.
just gotta match the same capitalization that you're using before.
To
You're giving it a
the,
name
in
and
front
you
of the colon.
Yes.
You use the one in front of the colon when you're adding it.
Mhm.
Okay, making sure. All
Alright,
right,
so
good.
up on the screen, we have 3 buttons. They are very, very exciting. They say first, second, and third. They have no additional color. They have no functionality. We cannot interact with them with the keyboard. This is perhaps my greatest creation. So, in the interest of making my greatest creation do anything, let's add a couple of things to our game. One of the problems that Quorum currently has with the focus system being incomplete is that in a typical application, and this is a moment away from screen reader consideration, but rather for any kind of keyboard usage in general. When you are using the keyboard visually, anything that has focus is highlighted in some way. And there's 2 different things to consider here. One is that if I have no assistive technology whatsoever, I can still use the keyboard and I can tell what's focused because my button highlights with either a border around it or its color changes in a way that makes it obvious. Or if I am using assistive technology, a lot of, oh gosh, I'm trying to think of the correct thing. Bounding rectangles can be used to project very nice solid rectangles around whatever has focus to make it more obvious if you are low vision or if it's just something that whatever default they're using is very artistic and lovely but not very obvious to whoever is looking at it. We don't currently have any visual output for what has the focus for some components like the button, which we would like to fix for ourselves. So one of the things that I'm going to very quickly add here, just so we know what we are doing, is I am going to add a focus listener to this game. This will just help us, as we are working on this right now, to have a sense of what we are doing. So, the way that I'm going to do this is I am going to go back to the top of our game, and I'm going to add an extra class that our main is going to inherit from. I am going to inherit from the libraries.interface.events.focusListener class. Focus Listener is very useful in a number of different ways for any kind of interactions with the engine if we ever want to have special kinds of navigation or focus behavior. We do want to be very careful that we're not doing something so wild and radical that we are breaking the user's expectations for where they're going to go. But with clever use, you can do some really interesting things with focus. I'm going to head and add, after game, I'm going to put a comma, a space, and then I'm going to add the second class that we're now going to inherit from the focus listener.
Sorry, I had to get all the checks and stuff, and
It's all good.
Sue tackled me and had a curriculum thoughts, so hopefully it's going okay.
I think it's going pretty well. Team has tolerated my existence so far, so that's a good sign.
I did not know we didn't have visible focus state. That was a
That was one of the things I was.
omission for me.
That was one of the sort of things I was rushing to try and put in as we were moving up to release. And I got it in for like the trees at the last second, like the day before, I think.
And it's in there for tabs.
Tabs have it, the tree has it, buttons do not have it, the radio buttons and checkboxes don't have it.
Sure.
Expect that to be one of the things that I try to fix soonest, because that bugs the living shit out of me when I'm working with it.
It is a little ironic though that sometimes we actually build in some accessibility features first.
And just like a general rule of thumb, like the reason for the focus state, the reason for any of the stuff we've been talking about, any interface you build, it doesn't matter if it's a text-only interface, a VR interface, anything, really needs to answer three fundamental questions. Where am I? Where can I go from here? And how can I get there? If you can answer these three questions, whether you're using your eyes, fingers, nose, ears to do it, doesn't matter, right? That's just a matter of modality. So the reason like there's a focus highlight is because that tells you where you are. The reason there's shortcuts and things like that is that tells you how do I get there. The reason the tab key allows you to navigate around is that you can explore where can I go from here. So that's the reasoning. If you just have these three rules in your head, you understand the underpinnings of every interface humanity has ever made.
So I have just added 2 additional components to my code here. In order for us to be able to track the focus, what we're going to do is we're going to use the focus as listener gain focus action. This is just like when we were handling the empty actions that I showed you in the dialogue. Gain focus is another one of these actions that we can override from the focus listener, and it will know the right time to call it when components gain the focus. So what I'm interested in doing here is I'm going to take the focus event and I am going to do a check. I'm going to ask, for the focus event, it contains an item. Or, actually, do you remember, is it, Stefik, do you remember what the focus event's getter for whatever the new focus is? Does it get new focus?
I'm sorry, what?
I'm trying to remember the syntax for this. I can go look it up in the source code super quick if I need to, but.
No, but I can pull it up real quick. It's focus event.
So in the focus event,
It's
Get new focus. there we go. Teamwork. So,
Oh, thank you.
in the focus event, it has an item which is whatever just got the focus. This is the event : get new focus. It returns to us an item. An item could be 2D or 3D. Our focus system can accept focus for 3D components, and you can do focus traversal through the 3D environment. We don't have a ton of stuff supporting that at the moment. You can do it, but it's not anything very exciting. Expect us to expand on that in the future, though, because that's one of the things we're most interested in trying to tackle. That being said, because I am making, I don't know why I added this end here. I need that later. Because I added a new object type, though, I am going to need a use statement for it. So libraries.interface.item. In our case, what items have we added to our game?
Buttons.
We have buttons. Yeah, exactly. We have 3 different buttons in our game. All of those buttons are considered items by the system. Now, in the system, whenever a gained focus event, or whenever something gains the focus that did not previously have the focus, this gained focus event is going to fire. In order to make sure that we are telling ourselves what's getting the focus, we're going to request, please tell me whatever the new focus is, and we're going to output its name to the console. There is one thing we have to be careful about here, which is that it is possible that the item that is the new focus could be undefined. It could just be the case that there is no focus in the game engine. Because we don't want to crash our environment, we are going to test for that before we output it. So, if the item is not equal to undefined, we will output something. Else, we will output something else. So what I'm going to output is, if the item is not undefined, output item :get name plus gained focus. If it is undefined, we do not want to try and call anything on that item, because if it doesn't exist and we try and ask it to do something, the application will say, I can't do that, there was nothing there, and it will crash the program. So, in that case, we'll just simply output focus was undefined. Or suppose focus is undefined is more correct. So we're doing a little bit of extra legwork here just to help inform ourselves of what's going on in the environment. But what we get to do next is, actually, before we go on to what's next, we should also make sure it will inform the game of what's going on. And we will say add focus listener. And we will tell it that it itself is a focus listener, not to be listening to the focus. Me is a special keyword that says I, the object that am currently executing code, I, the game, I, the main class, I am a focus listener. Please tell me the focus events. Is everyone on board and everyone familiar with where we're at right now? I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to build this, double check to make sure that what I have done is correct and that it compiles. And also, although I have not set up keyboard navigation at the moment because I have not set a tab traversal order, which is obviously important, I can still set focus on things right now via the mouse. When you click on things, they get focused. If I click on that first button gains focus. I click on the second button gains focus.
But to be fair, it also activated that button.
It did. The button does not do anything, but
Sure,
it is
it's
focused.
a very important distinction that activation for blind people, for screen reader users, the act of activation is always decoupled from the act of selection.
Yes.
Whereas for the mouse, what you see is what you can click.
Yep. So any questions before we get to the core of what we're doing here with the tab traversal? Do I need to show a different part of the code, or? Yep. Cards Against Humanity, man. Cards Against Humanity. Good decisions were made last night.
Oh, so under my else output, I put another end.
And you know where you're going?
Okay, so I missed one.
If you scroll up to the top,
Action code game.
make sure that you
Oh,
add
this is
the
another
inheritance
end.
name that it is also a focus.
So you have your
Comma.
end if statement, but you also need your end for
Okay.
action.
Come on.
So one
4
more
minutes
end.
until lunch.
Here or here?
Yeah,
So under
it's-
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so I need to
Do I need
make
to
sure
go to
this
the
action
building?
has an end.
This is a smidge buggy right now,
Yeah,
it's
maybe
probably
have
text, so.
That has an end.
Research prototype, but
But
getting
else
there.
if is supposed to have an end, that's right. Okay.
3D animations and stuff.
Oh, really?
With
Oh,
all
okay.
custom
Yes.
drawings.
Okay, missing
Ends
an end.
that are so easy.
Alright.
Overlooked an end, thank you.
Accessibility calls it 3D
Okay, all that for, now, if you.
We set up
Discussion,
foundation
say that the
for
first
doing
one's
that
gonna focus.
down the road. Oh, it's already happening?
You could do it
Yeah,
today.
you can do that.
That's false.
Yeah.
Is it supposed to be false?
All right. So
No, mine doesn't say this.
we've gone through a bunch of extra legwork just to make sure that we, the developers, know what's going on and that we can set ourselves up to understand what's going on. Let's actually set up the tab focus order. What we're going to do is we're going to start by making sure that something in the game ought to start with the focus right now. Let's go ahead and focus the first button.
Okay, yeah.
Saying something, but-
With this code, as soon as I launch the window, the first button will start with the focus. And that should also mean that we can expect to see that immediately when the program runs, our game's focus action is going to tell us that the first button was immediately focused. We'll see it in the console when we start it. Past that though, this only has focused one of the buttons. It hasn't told the system how it gets around to the other buttons. So what we're going to do is I'm going to take the first button and I'm going to tell it to set the next focus. And this takes an item, something that is focusable, such as our buttons. So the next focus from the first, what should the next focus be from the first button? Second button. I'm also going to set the previous focus. What is the previous focus from the first button?
Third.
It's the third button. We're going to let this wrap around. And then let's go ahead and let's set up the second and third buttons. What's the next focus from the second button? It's the third. And the previous focus for the second button?
So it's only one direction? It does not apply the opposite direction when you said previous?
So, the way that we have this designed, you can manually set what it goes to, but the next focus is what you'll be reaching when you press tab, and that's going to be iterating through from the first to the second to the third, and then from the third, we'll iterate back to the first. We'll have it wrap around.
So my question is about this line, 46.
Mhm.
So when you said the next focus of first is the second, does it imply the previous button of second is the first? Do you still need that line?
I'm trying to remember what the explicit reasoning behind why we decided not to do that was. I think that part of our...
There isn't a good one right now.
Yeah.
That's probably the right answer.
So, again, this is getting revamped, and so the
I expect that to
implication
change.
should be
Yeah.
that they're bi-directional, because there is a hard rule in interfaces that the opposite of the current action has to return you. This is why menus wrap, by definition, not in Quorum, but other, proper menus wrap. And they will in Quorum as well. And so the reason is that the opposite of the action you take should always return you back to where you were. It's just a golden rule of iSphere interfaces.
Yeah, I'm not sure why we did it. I think we just didn't think about it that carefully.
Yeah, I think that we didn't know for sure if there was some edge case we weren't considering. It's like, we'll just leave it open for ourselves,
I think
because
that's
we
what
know
it
we're going to
was.
be coming revamping the system
Yeah.
anyway.
So right now you have to do it, but
This
soon
is
you
sort
don't
of,
have to
this is
do it.
definitely
Well,
the sort of thing
the other
we-
thing that's tricky in
addressing.
Quorum as well is that Cena right now is thinking about it from the perspective of a user interface that is usable by human beings, right?
Right.
And sometimes in Quorum too, we're trying to thread the needle between this is also a game engine, and you might want to do something that actually doesn't make sense from a usability perspective to add complexity. It's sort of like putting one singular button on the screen that says I win might very well be a game, but it's not a very damn fun one. And so maybe you want to manipulate stuff in some funny way because it's part of your game, but I don't know. But generally,
That's-
that's a pretty,
Again, you
It's
can
a
always
stretch.
give the developers choice to do it.
it's a stretch, but yeah.
Alright, so I have added our extra code here to set up our focus traversal order here. So, I go ahead, that is set focus, not just focus. Yep. I have done typo on line 41. Well, line 41 on my code.
Ah, it worked.
That's what mine was wrong. Same thing.
What is the opposite there? Shift tab?
Shift tab.
Yes. So, we run our program, we see that first has the focus, and then we can tab through our order here. And we haven't set up a behavior on these buttons. These buttons currently do nothing, but if we were to attach a behavior to these items, what I could find is if I were to tab to, for example, the second button, pressing space would activate that button. it would trigger whatever the behavior on the button is, just as if we had clicked on it or touched it on a touchpad or etc.
Right, and all, yeah, if you touch it with a touch listener, it's automatic too, right?
Yep.
I forget, yeah. So if you made this button on an Android device, you get the same behavior,
Mm-hmm.
barring a bug.
So I believe it is just about lunchtime. Are there any questions?
I know. Dude, I'll tell you, I mean, we've invented a lot of stuff in the lab, by far.
All right, let's call it for
Quorum is
lunch.
the hardest.